had some issues with people who were like upset because you had been what they thought, far too harsh in your critiques of some alternative media people who are not that bad.
Right.
And I don't know if I want to name names and get into that whole discussion, but there's like a side. There are a lot of folks like who appear on RT and things like that who are doing honest, ethical work, and maybe we don't completely agree with them about everything. And in particular, let's face it, a lot of these people are a little bit timid about talking about Zionism. Because look what happens when you do. Adrian Salbucci tries to report on RT that the Zionists are buying up Patagonia, and they can him. So that's a legitimate
Right.
issue. But I've
Right.
heard people, I know people who think that you've been too harsh on some of those people who are actually basically competent, sincere people. So, I mean, do you
Well,
make that distinction between, people like Alex going completely nuts versus some of these other people who are just a little bit, wrong, or you don't completely agree with them?
I don't accuse people of going to the other side unless it's very obvious that they've done that. I mean, with some of those RT people, I think you're referring to some of these individuals that are promoting Vladimir Putin as the God sent savior of the world. And I've been kind of critical of Putin. I've delved into some of his history. I think when we look at false flag terrorism, I mean, it really begins with Putin and his false flag terrorism in Russia back in the day in 1999 with the apartment bombings. That was
Wait,
actually
wait, how does it begin with that?
well, it doesn't begin, but that's sort of where this whole shift towards blaming Muslims for terrorism, it's sort of that was one of the big events that really set that narrative in motion. So Putin and the West really had a lot of common goals and narratives, and a lot of Putin's rhetoric early on in his career was consistent with Zionist talking points, was consistent with the neocon narrative. In fact, Putin was the first guy to call Bush after 9/11. There was a report that was put out by ABC News where they interviewed Putin. This was right after the invasion of Afghanistan, and Putin was singing the praises of George Bush. He was shaking hands with Bush. He was saying Bush is a great leader. He pledged Russian support for the war on terror. Russia allowed the U.S. to use some of its airspace to launch operations against Afghanistan. So Putin was really trying to, create his spot in this new world order. And
Well, he didn't have much choice. Let's face it. They went to what DEFCON 3 or whatever it was. They put the nukes on the highest possible alert, and at that time, Russia still hadn't rebuilt its military at all. I mean, it was a complete basket case. So just like these other countries, when they threatened to nuke Pakistan back to the Stone Age, as Musharraf later admitted, and they probably made the same threats against Saudi Arabia and other places. After 9/11, it looked like the Americans were just going to, nuke anybody that they felt like, and so the whole world was terrorized into submission, and certainly Putin was too.
well, I don't think that's really why he joined the campaign. I think he was being opportunistic about it. He wanted, I mean, he's a power guy. He came out of the KGB. He's, groomed in that whole spook mythos, and he's held on to power for 15 years, mostly by, eliminating his opponents. So there's a lot of suspicions with Putin and the apartment bombings. I mean, they caught those FSB agents planning explosives in an apartment in Ryazan, which kicked off that whole Chechen war, which he used as his political impetus, as his casus belli to solidify his grip on power, to create a new order around him and the FSB. I mean, really, it's just sort of he sort of took out some oligarchs so that and then replaced them with his personal friends and took control of some of their resources and created Gazprom, which is a big player in the whole oil and gas market, which ultimately does business with some of these reprobate players like Israel. Russia and Israel have been doing gas deals, and they just signed a 20-year gas deal with Israel. So this idea that Putin is some moral man, I mean, this I can't think this is anything but absurd.
Mm-hmm.
He's a guy that comes out of the KGB, comes out of that system. How could you become the head of the FSB and be a moral person who has concern for his fellow man? And on top of that, I mean, he's done a lot of things that people like today, he's done some things that to counteract NATO in some ways in the Middle East. Not too much. I mean, he actually signed off on that no-fly zone in Libya. So I think with Putin, it's a mixed bag. I mean, he's an opportunist first and foremost. He's a businessman. He does business and shakes hands with anybody and everybody. So he's really not committed to saving the world. He's not an anti-Zionist. He supports Israel openly. He shakes hands with Netanyahu. There's plenty of business relations between Russia and Israel, and they share a common view of World War II. So Putin just recently passed the Holocaust denial laws in Russia. They share a common view about Muslims, right? Putin doesn't like the Chechens and those North Caucasus Muslims, and he based his whole career on being an anti-jihadist freedom fighter, right? And staged those apartment bombings. So he has a lot of things in common with Israel and the West, but he has some differences with them. So what I'm seeing with Russia and China is they're really opportunistic players in this, and they're not there to take down the West or take down Israel as some people have been fantasizing about. They're there to maybe slow it down a little bit, so insofar as it benefits their interest to do that. But then they go along with other things that suits their narrative. So I think there's a lot of hero worship and this over-the-top rhetoric that's being thrown out there with regards to Putin, and that's the stuff I was criticizing with those some of those RT commentators who are literally like saying that if you criticize Vladimir Putin, you work for the CIA or something. I mean, this is like the black and white world they live in. So I think that's some of the stuff you were hearing.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a lot of truth in what you're saying about Putin. But I think you might have gone a little too far in sort of, taking these people who maybe were saying if you criticize Putin, you're working for the CIA, and then you're like kind of accusing them of being Russian shills and being on the payroll of the Russians and things like that without evidence, which I think that we want to be careful with that kind of stuff for sure. But actually with the Putin thing, Brandon, you may have seen that I did this parody a while back. The headline was USA seeks to join Russian Federation. And it begins, fed up with their nation's corrupt, mendacious, ineffectual leadership, a group of Americans is seeking to join the Russian Federation. And we're collecting signatures for a national referendum on whether to remain a failed state, an economic basket case run by criminal oligarchs, or to join the Russian Federation under a president with a proven track record of bringing oligarchs to heel. And on like this, with a sign, Putin for president. And, It's a parody, of course. But I had a tremendous amount of feedback coming in from people who didn't think this was a parody, and especially from Russia, that Russians were all over this piece and completely missing that it was a parody, and thinking that there really was a group of Americans that was trying to have the USA join the Russian Federation. So I think that you're right. There's like a kind of people have gone a little overboard here, but maybe the other side here is that Putin, in working with these oligarchs, as you know, was it 7 of the 8 oligarchs were Jewish Zionists with dual citizenship with Israel. These were the billionaires who came out of the collapse of the Soviet Union with all of the goods, pretty much, because under the Soviet Union, you couldn't make any money legally. So the only people who could make any money were organized crime figures, and it so happened for some reason they were all Jewish and Zionist. And so the system collapsed, and they ended up with everything. And the whole country was looted. And when Putin came to power, as you say, partly through the false flag apartment bombings, he did, I think, reassert a certain amount of national interest at the helm of the Russian state over these criminal oligarchs who are out of control. And so I think the Zionists are not that happy with the way Putin has reasserted a certain kind of Russian national interest. And
well, I wouldn't call that a Russian national interest, because all he did was take their money and invest it in this Gazprom company, which he's the oligarch of. I mean, he's a billionaire. He surrounds himself with billionaires. So he just kind of replaced some rival oligarchs, and I don't believe that he went after those oligarchs because they were Jewish Zionists. I mean, Putin himself supports Israel. He supports he supported the latest Gaza campaign. He actually said that it was Hamas's fault that they started the recent conflict there. So he is himself pro-Israel. He said Israel is a special state to Russia because there's about a quarter of Israel's population are Russians, Russian-speaking Israelis. and they vote in Russian elections. So he's stated over and over again that he has an affinity for Israel, that he supports Israel, he has a respect for Israel. He's not a hardline psychotic like Kudnik. Now that's the caveat I'll make. He is not a Netanyahu guy who wants to run down Gaza and nuke the Palestinians. He's somewhat more reserved in that. But at the end of the day, he's not opposed to Israel's existence. He's not opposed to the current configuration of Israel. He's not making a big fuss about the settlements. He very mildly criticizes Israel like you'd find from an opposition party in the West, like the opposition parties in Canada sometimes criticize Israel, but he doesn't go very far in his critiques of Israel at all. So with those oligarchs, he had a personal beef with a few of them, specifically Berezovsky. And funny thing is, Berezovsky helped put Putin into power, and another guy, Roman Abramovich, another Jewish Zionist oligarch, he was one of Putin's right-hand men right in the early stages of his rise to power with Yeltsin. So he had the backing of all of these Jewish oligarchs initially, and then once Putin realized that Berezovsky had his own ideas about how the Russian state would advance and how the system would be set up, and some of these other oligarchs, he started to crack down on them for personal political reasons. And I liken it almost exactly to Stalin's feud with Trotsky, right? So Stalin had that feud with Trotsky where he kicked out Trotsky because they were rivals. They had their own ideas about how the Soviet Union would be run, and they conflicted on that. So Stalin kicked out Trotsky, and he had several top Bolsheviks who happened to be Jews as well executed, not because they were Jews, not because they were Zionists, but because they were political opponents. So I think people are kind of misreading Putin's pushback against a few of those oligarchs. He didn't take them all down. I mean, Roman Abramovich, he's not one of them that Putin seized that guy's assets. He let that guy go to England, and he's running the Chelsea football team, and I think he still has connections to Russia. And there was just a recent article published in the Jerusalem Post with the title Putin beside an army of Jewish billionaires. So there's still Jewish billionaires in Russia. There was a report in Ynet News saying 25% of the top richest Russians are Jewish. So this idea that Putin is cracking down on those guys simply because they're Jews or Zionists, I think that's a bit of a stretch. It's a bit of a misreading of that situation.
Yeah, I can see that. Well, let me throw out an alternative narrative here and see how you react to it. Okay, so let's just say that perhaps there's a new world order plan, and it's tied in with Zionism. The maximal version of this would be that a bunch of fanatical Jewish heretics who came up with this crazy idea of a sort of satanic plan to force God's hand and bring back the Messiah by invading Palestine, even though God didn't want that, because the Jews are supposed to wait till God takes them to Palestine without any effort on their part. But these satanic Jewish heretics said, no, we're going to go to Palestine ourselves, and this is part of a satanic cult that ritually commits abominations and ends up in control of Freemasonry. And so these people are working on a plan to create world government from Jerusalem. They're going to put the Antichrist on the throne in Jerusalem as the dictator of a new world order. That's what the new world order plot is. And this requires watering down all the other nations and weakening them and so on, taking down the Goyim, which means the other nations. And Putin, being something of a Russian nationalist, is not exactly on board with that. And in fact, he and the Chinese and the BRICS nations and these other sort of anti-imperial forces are the last thing standing between the Antichrist regime, New World Order, world dictatorship, and the world we have now. So that's according to this interpretation, any kind of movement against this world Zionist dictatorship of financiers that's supposed to morph into a kind of a satanic new world order ruled by the Antichrist is not a bad thing. That Putin is like the best thing going in that department. I take it you wouldn't fully agree with that.
Well, I don't think Putin is the best thing going in that department. I think the forces on the ground physically opposing that, or groups like Hezbollah, the Palestinians, Iran, to some extent, is sort of leading that effort. And if you just look at the freedom with which those politicians are able to speak about issues, people like Nasrallah, people like Ahmadinejad, even Assad to some extent, although he's quite reserved in his statements about Israel and so forth. But those guys are able to speak the truth. They're able to talk about false flag terrorism. They're able to talk about the truth about the Second World War. And Chavez was also a guy that was able to speak freely, because these are truly independent leaders who don't, their interests are completely opposed to that vision that you've laid out there, that Zio-Khan Jewish supremacist vision that some of these messianic Jewish leaders have. And I think the first guy to lay out something like that was Ben Gurion, right, when he made that famous quote in 1961, where he talked about this world government forming, that the United Nations would headquarter itself in Jerusalem. There would be no more wars. There'd be an international police force, and that they would build a shrine dedicated to the prophets to serve a federated union of all continents based in Jerusalem. So he kind of laid out this like Old Testament prophecy of like Jewish supremacism. And I guess a lot of those guys believe that. Like Netanyahu had that famous meeting with the Rebbe, the famous Rebbe, the leader of like Orthodox Judaism, and the Rebbe encouraged him to hasten the coming of the Messiah, right? That when they believe the Messiah returns, then all the Gentile nations will just be blown over, and they will have their little fiefdom. So I think those elements that are fighting directly against that are the true opponents, and just average people like me and you know, average citizens of the West who see what's going on, who are speaking out against it, who are committed to exposing these evil things. These are the people who deserve credit. I think Putin, he's done a lot of evil in his career. He's killed people, he's murdered innocent people to get where he is today. He's compromised a lot on different things. So I don't think we should give him all the credit. I mean, he's put his foot down on a few issues, and you can give him credit for those things, but that doesn't wash away all of the evils that he's done, and all of the compromises he's made, and all of the collaboration that he's done with these evil forces. He's shaking hands with Netanyahu. If you're a true humanitarian, if you're a true opponent of this globalist New World Order, Zionism, and all the rest of it, you're not shaking hands with Benjamin Netanyahu. You're condemning him because he's an evil war criminal. But these Chinese leaders and these Russian leaders and these other Eastern big powers are not very principled on a lot of these issues, especially on the World War II issue. They're in lockstep with that. So I don't give those guys a lot of credit. I'm very suspicious of big powers generally. Big powers cannot act altruistically or in the interest of average people. They act in the interest of the elite of those countries. I think that's true with the United States, and everybody recognizes that that's true with the United States. But then they think like a country like Russia, extremely powerful, second most powerful military in the world, a country like China, then the burgeoning superpower, that these countries are going to be, you know, bastions of virtue, bastions of freedom. I mean, I think it's just a fantasy. People tend to divert to this hero worship narrative when they feel hopeless. You know, that's kind of the sensation and the impetus people pursue when they feel like, you know, everything's hopeless, the whole world's taken over by these evil forces. So we need to kind of look to somebody who has some semblance of influence in the world that will be able to stop this. So I think it's really just kind of false hope people are putting in these figures. It doesn't mean everything those people do is bad, but I would say that it's quite foolhardy at this point to point to a guy like Putin, knowing all that evil in his background, is going to be the Messiah that's going to deliver us to some grand age. I think it's just a bit fanciful.
Well, I agree. Putin's definitely not the Messiah. I don't think either the good Messiah or the bad Messiah, either one.
Some people think he's the Messiah, to be like literally.
Yeah. Well, I would not be on board with that. And you know, if that's the case, anybody who says that deserves whatever ridicule you're going to heap on them. On the other hand, I think it's one thing to critique Putin and critique the people who are inordinately pro-Putin, but I still think we need to do that in a reasonable way and not necessarily burn bridges with all those people, because I don't think they're as, you know, they're not as wrong as somebody like Alex Jones is for joining the neocon stampede. But do you think there's a connection here between the way people have set Putin up as this kind of macho hero figure who's going to save the day, and the way that some of the same kinds of people are doing that with Trump? Because both those guys seem like they're getting a lot of traction among ordinary populist kinds of people who are pissed off about the New World Order but don't really understand it. And that macho attitude that both of them have seems to attract a certain kind of psychology, and a certain kind of person supports that.
Well, just recently, I think it was Trump that said some nice things about Putin, and Putin reciprocated those comments to Trump. So they're sort of becoming buddies now, and
Next thing you know, they'll be photographed together shirtless on a horse or something. And
right. I
frankly, I
mean,
think Putin probably would look better that way than Trump would.
so I think what the elite are doing is they're kind of setting up these false heroes for us to throw all our support behind, all of our weight behind, and they're really just false choices. I mean, they're just sort of guys that are being promoted now because they realize that everything's so corrupt, and a lot of people are pissed off about the situation in the United States and foreign policy and everything. So they're putting out these sort of false heroes that seem a little bit better than what we have. I mean, Trump, he seems at least not as crazy, not as militaristic as some of these other Republicans. You know, he's still beating the war drums about ISIS, and he's really kind of feeding that Islamic terrorism narrative. And he said Muslims are dancing on 9/11 when it was Israelis, and he's putting out disinformation that seems to play into these Iocon narratives. There's many excuses people come up with for this, but I mean, this idea that Trump's gonna like clean the slate in America and send it, make America great again and fix all of these issues, I don't believe that's possible. I think there's too many systemic problems with the American system that whoever gets in, it really doesn't matter. Their hands are kind of tied on many different issues because there is this thing called the shadow government that people aren't considering. Trump can say all the good things he wants in the run up to this election. I mean, Bush himself campaigned on an anti-imperial ticket. He was saying America shouldn't be involved in the nation building and so forth. And then as soon as he gets into office, he helped stage 9/11 and launch the war on terror. So they can say all this stuff in the lead up to an election. It's really disingenuous. He's trying to win votes. I mean, until they get into office and you see what they actually do, there's no reason to put any weight behind anything they're saying, right? But
Indeed not.
with Putin, and I mean, it's similar with Putin. He's being plugged as this tough guy, this independent leader. He's asserting Russian interests and so forth. And he seems good compared to Western leaders. I agree. He seems better compared to these sort of Israeli prostitutes that we have here in the West, even though he's quite pro-Israel himself, but just not to the extent that we have here in the West. So these things seem good, right? They seem a little bit better than what we have, but I have a bit higher standard than just something that's slightly better than what we have. You know, I'm looking for something better than that, something more revolutionary than that. And what I was saying about those pro-Russia people, I mean, they're throwing the accusations at me. Most of what I was saying about them working for Russia or whatever, they would come to me every time I would critique Putin. I'd have about 50 trolls that would instantly come on my video and say, "You're a CIA agent. You're clearly working for the West." And it's nonsense because 95 to 99% of all of my critiques in my work is focused on the U.S. and Israel and their corruption and evil and their evil foreign policy gambits, right? I cut my teeth on exposing 9/11 and false flag terrorism. So how can anyone possibly say that I'm pro-West or pro? Like I am one of the most outspoken people, at least in my neck of the woods, about these issues, and that is my focus, and is still my focus because those are bigger evils than Putin. I acknowledge that Putin is a lesser evil than the West, than Israel at this point in time, but that doesn't negate his crimes or his evil in his own backyard. So I think we can't let that blind us. So I'm really responding to a lot of those people who like to throw accusations, and I was just pointing out that a lot of these Putin types, they're on Russia Today. So my inference is that you don't get on Russia Today unless you're pro Putin and pro Russia, and I can give a perfect example because one of those outlets, it was called Sputnik News, which is an offshoot of RT. They wanted to interview me about ISIS, and I was gonna go talk to them about ISIS, and then before the interview they canceled it very suspiciously. Said, "Oh, sorry, our time slot's up," and then they gave me like 4 time slots, and then I said, "Well, what about this one?" And then she said, "Oh, that one's taken too." It was clearly she was lying. I mean, the reason they won't have me on is because I criticize Putin, right? So if you criticize Putin, you don't get on that media. You cannot get on that media because it is controlled by Putin. So that's what I pointed out. If you're a commentator on RT, you're touting that line, and you're censoring yourself from looking honestly at Putin in Russia, because you're sort of working, in a sense, working for a Russian media outlet. So that's what I was implying when some of these people are saying that I'm saying they're working for Russia. Well, in a sense they kind of are, because they're working for Russian media, which is a tool of Putin, right? So
Yeah, see, I would be careful about that. If somebody is leaving troll comments on your YouTube and calling you a CIA agent, yeah, by all means, hit them back. Hit them back twice as hard. But just then going from there and making that kind of accusation to people just because they've been on RT, I don't think that's right. Like I've been on RT a number of times, and yeah, I've noticed that like the last thing I did for RT, I don't think they ever broadcast it. I did two things recently. One on German RT, which they did broadcast in German, and another in English RT just a month ago or something, and they never broadcast that one. And I think it's because I was too hardcore on the false flags and the Zionism. So I think you're right. They're timid about that. That's not good. Press TV from Iran is much better. The Iranians have a lot more guts. I mean, they're
right,
not nearly as powerful as Russia, yet they're willing to tell the full hard-hitting truth. So
right.
shout out to my friends in Tehran. So I'm with you on all of that stuff. But on the personal level, though, you shouldn't say just because somebody's been on RT, has been on RT, and isn't criticizing Putin, that's not enough to call them an agent. You got to distinguish between the people who called you an agent, those guys you hit back. But
of course,
just because somebody's on RT, no.
I don't know who's talking to you and what they're saying. I mean, they could be embellishing embellishing stories and whatnot. So we have to kind of
we can continue. We can have that.
Let
the rest
those drama aspects. I mean, a lot of these people are pissed off, and a lot of emotions run high in some of these alt media circles. I mean, I try to be calm all the time. I mean, I'm pretty.
It's hard sometimes, isn't it? Though.
Right. I mean, I'm pretty laid back about it. I mean, I try to find the humor in a lot of these things, as you do, and shit, making light of a lot of it, because it's so crazy, it's so dark and disturbing, a lot of this stuff. So, I mean, I'm not even, I don't have this animosity towards them. I mean, a lot of them are very aggressive, and they're putting a lot of weight into this Putin thing, and they don't like that I'm pushing back against that a little bit, because I'm really the only one that I've seen majorly critiquing Putin in any meaningful way. Most people are jumping on the bandwagon. It's basically unanimous across the alt media that that's the new talking point, that you support Putin and so forth. So I'm really the only one that's being a contrarian on that in a big way. So a lot of people don't like that and are pissed off about that. So I mean, I'm just kind of responding to them, and maybe I've gone a bit too far, perhaps, in pushing back against that. So I mean, it is what it is.
Yeah, well, I think your overall position on this is actually appreciated by a fair number of Muslims who have been, a lot of folks from the southern side of Russia, the Muslim world that stretches all the way from the Middle East out to Xinjiang, China. Those people suffered horribly under Soviet occupation and some wars that really you could say they turned into genocides. And what's happened in Chechnya, of course, is another, arguably a genocide and just a horrible atrocity.
Right. I find a lot of people in the alt media very dismissive of anything to do with Chechnya or Chechens or anything that conflicts with Russia, really. I mean, anything that conflicts with Russia's interest. I mean, Russia is an imperial state. It's not as it's not as aggressive, and it's rolled back a lot of its colonial outposts, and especially post-Cold War, but it gobbled up half of Europe after World War II. Are you telling me that wasn't an act of aggression? I mean, the reason they didn't have to go out and invade these far-off lands like the U.S. was doing is because they'd already taken over half of Europe, most of Central Asia. They had exported communism to all their neighbors, including to China. So they didn't really need to invade some far off country like the U.S. was doing, because they had all these Eastern Bloc countries to look after and maintain their grip and control over those. So, with Chechnya, a lot of the alt media just try to dismiss them as they're terrorists. Like they use the same talking points that you hear Netanyahu spewing about the Palestinians, about Hamas and Gaza. They actually use those exact same talking points when it comes to Chechnya. They're just fanatical religious zealots and they have no real gripe with Russia. And the fact that Stalin deported the entire population of Chechnya to the Gulag, and then as soon as they got semi-independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Yeltsin invaded in 1994 based on a false flag and killed several, I think it was about 50 to 100,000 Chechens in that first conflict. And, civilians, entire villages just leveled to the ground, pure bombardment, Israeli style. In fact, Netanyahu and Sharon and the Israeli hardliners actually supported it. And there's an article which I quote in my big Putin expose where Sharon was applauding Putin and Ehud Barak was invoking Putin's hardline statements like I'm going to get the terrorists on the toilets, and Ehud Barak is a big fan of Putin, so there's a lot of connections there, and the talking points are almost identical. So they say, that the Chechens are just irrational terrorists and they have no real gripe with Russia and the terrorism that is real, that isn't staged over there, because a lot of it is staged just like the West. A lot of it is false flag or provocateur or lie hop stuff. But this alt media wants to avoid that. They don't want to look into that side of things. They don't want to look into Russian false flags. They want to talk all about American false flags and British and Israeli. But when it comes to Russia, no, that we can't look into that, right? I mean, all of these governments use false flags. I mean, false flag is just a standard technique of all imperial powers. So this idea that Russia would never do that is just absurd. I mean, they have done that, and they continue to do that, and they use very much the same talking points about terrorism and Islamic extremism as the Israelis use. And it's amazing to me that so many in the old media kind of parrot that on that end of things and parrot that narrative, but then use opposite arguments when it comes to the Palestinians, even though it's the same argument, right?